Cardassians, temples, and one very ripped Captain Sisko are just a few of the things to be found in 1995's Star Trek Crossroads of Time. But is this an adventure worthy of the Star Trek title, or a cheap cash-in on the license? Welcome, my name's Azadash and welcome to another retrospective video. When I first started to watch Star Trek as a child, I was only interested in the series which featured a starship, such as the Enterprise, visiting strange new worlds and solving the various challenges involved in intergalactic exploration. I think the theme of exploration was one of the key draws to the series for me, and it's for this reason that I didn't pay much attention to the Deep Space Nine series. The idea of the show being set on a space station, stuck in one place, just didn't really appeal to me as a child. But as I matured and became a teenager, my curiosity got the better of me and I began to watch it. It didn't take very long for me to be hooked on the series, and I still maintain that the final 2 seasons are some of the best Trek that you can watch. Now, if we are only counting mainstream, as in excluding any MMO or mobile-based games, there have been 4 total crossover games with DS9. Deep Space Nine Harbinger is a point-and-click adventure which, while frustrating at times thanks to some diabolical puzzle design, is a fairly entertaining adventure for the time. The Fallen is a third-person shooter which really requires a deeper appreciation for the source material to push through some of the game's many questionable mechanics. Then you have Dominion Wars, which apart from lacking some quality of life features and almost impossible system requirements for the time, is a pretty good space shooter. I've covered all of these games before, and I'll drop a link to those videos in the description. However, the first DS9 game was actually released for consoles in 1995, that being Deep Space Nine Crossroads of Time. I am playing the Genesis version here, however the game also released for Super Nintendo. While a detailed comparison of each version is not in scope for this video, it's generally down to personal preference as far as which version looks and sounds better, with some claiming that the SNES version's colour palette matches the series better, however most agreeing that the control and animation is superior on the Genesis. The version you are seeing in this video is the original Genesis version, being played on a 6-button Genesis controller. However, I should note that the game does not take advantage of the 6-button layout, with only A, B and C being used as face buttons. The story is told through a mixture of text scrolls and semi-animated cutscenes throughout the adventure, and does a pretty good job of telling a cohesive story from start to finish. And while watching the show is probably not essential to enjoying the story, I would say that it is highly recommended, as it helps explain some of the nuances like the Bajoran spirituality that is just not really covered in the game. The actual plot is pretty good and interestingly was reportedly written prior to the television series airing, which makes it even more impressive. The game begins with Captain Sisko responding to a member of the station's technical crew being attacked by an unknown assailant, only to find out that the entire station is at risk from a radicalized Bajoran group called the Redemptionists. These Redemptionists oppose the Federation's presence on the station. The story features its fair share of twists and turns, with the player visiting everywhere from the station, Bajor, the Gamma Quadrant, and even a starship overrun with Borg. There's also a fair bit of character switching which happens throughout the game, which provides a lot more depth to the story, with the player assuming control of a variety of favourite characters throughout the game, including the ability as Odo to shapeshift into a rat. Overall, the story is very good and would have certainly been worthy of a 2-part episode in DS9's early seasons. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's grab a phaser, navigate the wormhole, and head back to 1995 to remember Crossroads of Time. While it's tempting to label Crossroads as a platformer, that isn't exactly true, as while the game does feature a lot of platforming, there are substantial stretches of the game which feature vastly different mechanics. Firstly, there is the time spent in the game's pseudo-hub, being the DS9 promenade and control areas. These sections allow the player to explore some of the station and interact with various people you encounter, with some having key information that is needed to progress. There is a lot of fan service here, with everything from the ability to encounter Morn, who is the only person you can't talk to encountering Nog on the promenade trying to hock you some Yamek sauce. If you've watched the television series, you'll definitely appreciate the level of detail the developers have put into this part of the game. The time spent on DS9 is very linear, but still provides a challenge in knowing what items to use on what and who to speak to and when. Then there's the side-scrolling shooter segments of the game, which sees the player needing to do things like navigating the wormhole or chasing enemy ships. And like the station segments, these are really good and deliver a fairly tight control experience, which makes for a challenging but enjoyable stretch of the game. My only criticism here is the levels are very short and don't feature that much variety, but what is here is relatively solid. Lastly, coming in at about 80% of the overall adventure are the platforming and combat segments, and this is where the game starts to feel a lot less Star Trek and a lot more generic 90s platformer, often with mixed results. In any platformer, camera and control, along with level design, are very important factors in the overall experience the player has. Unfortunately, both the camera and control here are far from ideal. Firstly, the camera, while doing a decent enough job of following the player, doesn't feature the ability to look up or down, forcing the player to sometimes need to take blind leaps of faith as they descend within some of the levels, simply hoping that there is either a ledge or a floor which is not too far away to cause fall damage or even worse, kill you. Then there is control, which when combined with the level design, conspires against the player to make even the basic movements feel like a chore. There are several sections of the game which require you to jump over an obstacle. The issue is that when you press the jump button standing still, you can only jump up in place, meaning you need to be moving forward to be able to jump forward. This would be fine, but the margin the game gives you to be able to be moving forward enough to jump forward instead of simply jumping upwards means that more often than not you will impact the obstacle and take damage. There's also a lot of sections which require the player to jump up and grab a ledge. However, as with the obstacle navigation, the margin between standing in the exact right place to execute the jump and either falling off what you were standing on or not being able to grab the ledge are very unfriendly to all but the best platformer players. Combat in the platforming sections is passable, but nothing incredible. The player is able to equip either their fists or a selection of phasers and use them against the enemies, with some creative callbacks to the television series, like the fact that each weapon can only be used on the Borg once before they adapt to them. There is some frustration in dealing with some of the flying enemies, as the axis the player can aim is quite limited with no auto-aim, meaning you sometimes need to shuffle back and forth a bit to actually hit your target. However, all of these challenges in the platforming pale in comparison to the biggest issue the game has in these segments, the level design, or more to the point, the difficulty as a result of the level design. The game has a very questionable trope where it will set you a time-based objective and then layer further time-based objectives on top of this master objective, and then layer puzzles on top of this which require trial and error. Take for example the very first platforming level. You are given a time limit of 13 minutes to recover hidden explosives which are set to be detonated. Only when you pick up each one, you only have 24 seconds to take them to an emergency ejection tube which is scattered throughout the level. The level itself is a labyrinth maze, meaning that you need to try and explore enough of it to understand where the ejection tubes are before searching for the explosives, making sure that when you do locate an explosive, you remember where the nearest ejection tube is. If you fail to complete either of these tasks within the time limit, which I virtually guarantee you will on your first few playthroughs, you'll be returned to the start of the level with all progress reset. Even when you are not against a specific time limit, there are other obstacles which venture far too close to unfair than they really should. There's a section on Bajor where you find out that there are just random holes in the ground which you can fall through and die, setting you back not just to the start of Bajor, but to the start of the entire sequence that leads you to Bajor. Also located on Bajor is a very lengthy puzzle sequence which requires the player to enter a set of commands in a particular order over and over again. Only as far as I could ever tell, there is no actual logic to these commands, and they are simply random, requiring a very lengthy stretch of trial and error. Then there is the Borg level, and you know what, I'm not even going to go into detail on this because I'm getting frustrated just thinking about it. But just know that all of the above mechanics, time limits, labyrinth mazes, and unfair insta-kills all come together in one neat package to force the player to replay the level over and over again until you have done so enough times that you can recall the exact path to the exit. Crossroads of Time is without a doubt the most difficult video game I have played, maybe ever. But it's not really difficult from a skill perspective, rather it's difficult due to the sheer volume of trial and error required, leading to ultimately a very frustrating experience. For the time, Crossroads is a pretty good looking game, with the Star Trek environments being well realised, complete with a fair amount of detail. Animation is also really good, with a lot of care being taken to animate both combat and backgrounds, making the game feel very fluid and interactive throughout the entire adventure. There's also a few nice implementations of basic physics, such as the use of wind, which help to mix up the sometimes repetitive platforming segments. Now, the game does use a password system, and while this was common for the time, I really think that a dedicated save battery would have been a better option and allowed the developers to add a little more nuance to the item and inventory system. Regardless, I'd say the game's presentation is quite strong, and along with the story, definitely shines through as one of the brightest parts of the adventure. Sound design is a bit of a mixed bag. I think the music is actually really good. There's a pretty faithful rendition of the DS9 main theme used in the menu. As well as some relatively short looping but quite catchy tunes used throughout the levels. Sound effects, on the other hand, are okay, but not really of the quality found in other mainstream titles, with things like the phaser sounding like a very low quality sample. When I first started playing Crossroads, I was very impressed. The way the game had realised DS9, its crew, and the exploration focus to progress the plot all made me believe that I had discovered a true hidden gem. I was even thinking in my head that I could name this video something along the lines of, "I found the best Star Trek game hidden on the Genesis." Alas, all of these thoughts quickly evaporated when I reached the first platforming sequence of the game. I did have hopes that maybe it's just the first platforming level that is a challenge, but as I progressed through the game, I found it to get worse as opposed to getting better. Crossroads is at its best when you are exploring Deep Space Nine, and at its worst when you are platforming. The problem is that about 80% of the game is platforming. I do wonder if the incredibly challenging difficulty was implemented to avoid people being able to complete the game as a rental. I don't know. I do know that there are several other games which publishers specifically requested to be more challenging so to avoid this. However, the net result is a game that's not challenging so much as it is frustrating. A frustration that I think would keep even the most die-hard Trek fans from truly enjoying the game. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.